and welcome to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast. My name is Jesse, and I'll be your host. So on today's episode, we're going to head over to Cradle Bay, to our new town that we're going to live in. We're going to head over to the Yogurt Shoppe and get some frozen yogurt with our new weird friends, the Blue Ribbons, and then also try not to get brainwashed by evil scientists. But anyway, regardless of all that, we're going to be covering today 1998's Disturbing Behavior. Now, Disturbing Behavior for me is a recent watch. I think I watched it for the first time last year, I think, in 2022, I guess. It always was on the list because, you know me, I love me a good horror movie here and there, okay? I've covered, The Faculty and, Urban Legend and, things like that. So, of course, this was going to be on my docket, right? So, and I knew it had Katie Holmes in it, and I knew it had James Marsden, Cyclops, and I knew that much, I guess, but, I didn't really know exactly what it was about, so, I was like, all right, let me go into this. And when I watched it for the first time, I actually really liked it. I didn't think it was a bad movie. I kind of heard, oh, this was, a failure, and, all this stuff, and whatever, right? So I was like, but actually, no, this is a perfectly good movie. It's not terrible. Ultimately, it is kind of flawed in a way, but we'll get into it. I actually liked it when I first saw it, and I was like, all right, cool. And then after the fact, I found out all the information about how this movie got cut to shit so badly that, I found out all the other information that came after it, right? And that's what really made this an interesting film to me, where I was like, oh, wow, there's so much to the story behind this movie, kind of. And it's a prime example of just how horrible Hollywood and the film industry can be sometimes, when it comes to cutting a movie. And, this movie really, I think it was such a different kind of film when they shot it. And then because of the cuts and the studio mandated things and whatever, it got turned into something that I think is a shell of what it was supposed to have been. So, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the pod. But yeah, I do think this is a perfectly good little horror movie, and it was supposed to be, kind of like how Faculty is about kind of like an update to the Invasion of the Body Snatchers story. This was kind of like a Stepford Wives thing. I love me a good Stepford Wives movie. I love that 70s version. It's really good. This is kind of an update on that. But yeah, I'm interested to get into it today with this movie. But as we do normally on the show, we're going to move into some figures about the movie. We're going to go into the production history of a little bit of this, what's going on with the movie. And then we'll move into a plot summary as well. So without further ado, let's get on to those figures. So Disturbing Behavior was released on July 24th, 1998, and was directed by David Nutter, written by Scott Rosenberg, and produced by Armin Bernstein and John Shishtek. We're looking at an estimated budget of $15 million and a box office overall of $17,514,980. We're looking at a 33% on the tomato meter on Rotten Tomatoes and a 39% audience score. We're looking at an IMDb score of 5.6 out of 10 and a Letterboxd score of 2.8 out of 5. For our cast of characters, we have James Marsden as Steve Clark, Katie Holmes as Rachel Wagner, Nick Stahl as Gavin Strick, Bruce Greenwood as Dr. Edgar Caldecott, William Sadler as Dorian Newberry, Steve Railsback as Officer Cox, Chad Donella as UV, Tobias Meller as Andy Efkin, Tig Runyon as Dickie Atkinson, Catherine Isabel as Lindsay Clark, Ethan Embry as Alan Clark, Terry David Mulligan as Nathan Clark, and Susan Hogan as Cynthia Clark, Peter LaCroix as Dan Strick, Linda Boyd as Lucille Strick, Jay Brazo as Principal Weathers, AJ Buckley as Charles Chug Roman, Crystal Cass as Lorna Longley, Derek Hamilton as Trent Whalen, David Patco as Tom Cox, Daniela Evangelista as Daniela, and Julie Patzwald as Betty Caldecott. Some critical response quotes about Disturbing Behavior are as follows. We have Roger Ebert from the Chicago Sun-Times, who states, unlike Scream 2, which kids the horror cliches, Disturbing Behavior pretends they still hold power. But the movie is light on shocks and not ever scary. We then have Michael DeQuina from the MovieReport.com, who states, Marsden has blue eyes and clean-cut looks tailor-made for a bop pinup. and all the emotional depth and acting range of the page it would be printed on. And then we have Paul Totera from CNN.com, who states, lots of shots are held for upwards of a minute too. I know that's not much, but if you're ambitious enough to gain sustenance from something other than nice belly buttons, you take what you can get. So before we move into any kind of plot summary about disturbing behavior, I do just want to go over some of the production history of this movie and also especially the post-production and release of this movie. As I stated earlier, this has kind of a bit of a juicy story. So let's get on with it. So this movie was an international production between Australia, the United States, and Canada, because why else do you think Catherine Isabel's there? Obviously, it's Canadian, duh. But anyway, so Scott Rosenberg, who's the scriptwriter of this movie, his script for Disturbing Behavior was acquired by MGM in August of 1997, and Beacon Pictures signed on to produce the movie. And then they found David Nutter, who at this point had done a movie called Ceasefire back in the 80s. He had done a couple of TV shows. He did 21 Jump Street. He did Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, the TV show. And he's had a pretty good career in TV. He's actually the guy, for any of you Game of Thrones fans, he's the guy who actually directed the Red Wedding scene. So he actually won an Emmy for that. So that's kind of cool. So thankfully this movie did not derail his career, because it could have damn well almost have. They brought him on because they thought he would do a really good job with it, and he had been directing X-Files episodes, because at this point X-Files, when it first started, was kind of shaky a little bit, and so they brought on David Nutter. He did really well with directing, and so he made a name for himself with doing that, and I think that's kind of why they brought him onto this project, for that very reason. So David Nutter brought in a bunch of different people, actually, some folks he had worked with on X-Files and also Millennium. That's actually how Catherine Isabel's kind of in this movie, because her dad is Graham Murray, who was a production designer on X-Files, and his daughter was trying to be an actress, and so I was able to get her a little part on this, which is kind of cool. But even some of the other actors in this movie had come from the X-Files or Millennium or whatever, so they'd already worked with David Nutter before. But they did sign on James Marsden, who at this point had only really done a couple of things before this, so this was kind of a big deal for him. He was still kind of on the rise in a way. They brought him on. Then also a funny little story. So they also brought on Nick Stahl and Chad Dinella. Chad Dinella is a Canadian as well. If you don't know, he's UV. So they had to put him in a bunch of makeup to make him look really pale and all this. He is this guy he's the guy Todd in Final Destination, if you don't already know that. So he's the one who dies in the bathtub. He gets hanged and all that. So, but funny little story about casting. So I don't know who they were initially thinking of for Rachel's part, which ended up being Katie Holmes. But one of the things was that what had happened was they were auditioning the people from Dawson's Creek, apparently, because Dawson's Creek was, I guess, a Columbia show or whatever the hell. And so they had these people audition. So literally, I guess James Vanderbeek, Michelle Williams, Joshua Jackson, and Katie Holmes auditioned for the roles. And I guess David Nutter was looking at dailies for Millennium or something, because it was also done in the same production company type of thing, like same studio. And instead of looking at dailies for whatever, Millennium or the X-Files or whatever, he saw these dailies for Dawson's Creek because it was the same studio. And he saw, if you don't know what the dailies are, it literally is like the footage that you shot that day and that kind of thing. But anyways, it's like coverage and so it's what you're shooting. So he saw this scene with Katie Holmes and he thought she'd be great for the role of Rachel. And so as part of this, they already auditioned. They thought she did great. So they brought her in for Rachel. A lot of the principal photography of this movie occurred from about January 1998 to late March in Vancouver. So of course, a lot of these folks probably on the production were in some way Canadian, probably. And then also, because you have to do that in Canada, but also they came from the X-Files or Millennium as well, which I already kind of mentioned. So this movie literally got shot. And it was initially actually supposed to be about 115 minutes. That was the director's cut that David Nutter made. And they screened the movie for the executives, the executives really liked it. They were like, oh, this is a great movie. It's kind of there's a lot of depth to it. And, like I said earlier, it's a little bit like the Stepford Wives thing. That's what they were kind of going for. And it really feels kind of like an atmospheric type of thing. David Nutter said he envisioned the film as an atmospheric X-Files style thriller. But like the studio wanted a Scream style teen movie, and so we'll get into that a little bit, but he wanted it to be this. And so what ended up happening is that the executives were like, all right, cool, we like it, but we're going to screen it for test audiences. And what's funny is that with the test audiences that they had, which was like 18 to 24-year-olds, the demographic, this movie is rated R technically. And so a lot of the people in the test audience really liked it. But there were a couple people who maybe didn't like a few things in there. And instead of going with, the majority and maybe going on and doing this movie the way it was supposed to be, no, they decided to cut it. So it underwent numerous studio-mandated recuts and a reshoot of the original ending due to these negative test screenings. So a lot of the cuts in this movie were to scenes that provided plot and character development. What are some of those that you may ask? Well, a lot of it had to do with the parents in the town of Cradle Bay, where a lot of the stuff was cut out. There was a scene where Caldecott, the scientist behind the whole thing, earlier in the movie has a meeting with the parents, and he talks at length about his daughter, so that then later in the movie where we find out where Caldecott's daughter is, it makes a lot more of an impact. But guess what? They cut that part out of the movie. They also cut out parts with like, why did Steve's family move from Chicago to Cradle Bay? We end up finding out that, because we never really know what exactly happened to Alan, except apparently he died of suicide. But we don't know that actually it was a murder-suicide, apparently. And so that's cut out. God, so many things. Just like these different parts that the other thing as well that was cut out was the whole idea of why is Cradle Bay like this? Because Mr. Newberry, the janitor guy, he gives a whole backstory about literally what happened was that 3 years ago in this story, there were these kids that got drunk and drove, were speeding through the streets and ended up accidentally killing a mother and her son in a drunk driving accident. And apparently those teens also died. And so he even said, like, everyone died. And, he even said, now teens don't go and, drive drunk around Cradle Bay anymore. But now they also don't, dance or sing or laugh or whatever. And so that's a huge plot point of what is it, how did Caldecott get the power that he ended up getting to do what he does to these teens? But that whole story about the drunk driving accident, those kids and the parent, and the son dying and all that stuff, completely cut out. Just nothing. We don't know why, And it also gives a relationship between Mr. Newberry and Steve, because we see a deeper connection with them during that scene. A lot of these scenes also, some of them are on the Blu-ray as well. I don't actually have the Blu-ray or DVD. I really should get it though. But a lot of the stuff was cut out. So when you think about it, and I'll get into it in the plot summary, I guess, of what I'll be covering for the theatrical cut, because that's the only thing you can watch, really. It just, these things cut out a bunch of shit. Like, I think apparently there was more scenes with Lindsay's friend, and we only have one scene with her in it. You know what I mean? It's crazy. And they also changed the ending as well. That was another thing that they did. So actually MGM was having David Nutter do these cuts, but then Nutter was like, I can't keep doing this. So then they hired another editor to George Folsey Jr. They hired him to do a bunch of cuts, but then he cut it down to like 72 minutes, and it was horrible. And so then they ended up getting it back to 84 minutes, which is pretty much where it stands right now. And they also changed the ending as well. So the original ending of this movie is supposed to have been that Steve and Rachel, and I guess UV and Lindsay, they all end up on the ferry at the end, and Gavin is there with a gun, and he's going to shoot Steve, I guess, because he doesn't want to keep being a blue ribbon, but he doesn't know what else to be, and all this stuff, right? And so then he's going to shoot Steve, but then what ends up happening is that UV actually shoots Gavin, and then Gavin dies. He ends up being himself for a little bit while he's dying. He's back to his old self, and then he ends up dying. And so that happened, and it was a very kind of dark ending. And so they didn't do that, and yeah, they decided to go without that. You can still see this ending on YouTube, though, or I guess also probably on the Blu-ray. It's probably on there, too. But anyway, so you can still see that, and so these cuts were so bad and severe that Nutter really did consider taking his name off of this movie, but he did not do that. So it is still there. He almost Lona William'd it for Sugar and Spice. Funny enough, I actually just watched Sugar and Spice because it was free on YouTube. And that also has James Marsden in it. And I kind of love him in that movie because he's such a lovable himbo. But, you know, I love it. But yeah, it's just insane to me that, like, you know, this movie, David Nutter got exactly the movie he wanted. So much so, you call it the nut cut is what it is, which I think is funny. But he got him exactly the movie he wanted. And the fact that this movie got cut to shit so badly, and now it really is just in its kind of 84-minute glory that is the theatrical cut or whatever. It's still a perfectly fine movie, but it disjointed a little bit. Some of this stuff comes out of nowhere. Like, one of the things is, like, I think Steve's mom finds a gun that Steve took from Gavin earlier, and that was kind of why she called Caldecott in, you know, near the end of the movie. And so, but that just comes out of nowhere. And again, that's because shit got cut. So anyway, it's crazy to me. But again, you know, the fact that there is an actual director's cut of this movie that David Nutter actually has. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think Scream Factory was actually trying to maybe see if they could really release it. But I think MGM seems to be kind of the barrier, if you will, to that happening, which is so crazy to me because I feel like there are plenty of people, horror fans in particular, who I think would actually pay money to watch the director's cut of this movie, you know, and I just think, like, what is the problem? Like, what? And David Nutter even showed this director's cut to Fangoria magazine, and even Fangoria, the people who watched it, put in their magazine saying, hey, this actually, like, makes the movie a little bit better, and this is actually a better cut of the film. So, like, I just feel like, listen, I may or may not be doing a Blade Runner episode soon. Who knows? If Blade Runner can have a bunch of fucking cuts of the movie, and then we end up getting to this other cut of the movie, why can't you just release the fucking nut cut of director Certain Behavior? You know what I mean? I don't know. Whatever, it's just me. I did just want to mention, so there was a retrospective of this film. So a 2019 review from Gizmodo noted that the film really wants to offer a youthful new twist on some classic sci-fi themes and had the potential to be something more. And Cinesaps also states, in spite of all the hacking the studio inflicted upon Disturbing Behavior, many of the filmmaker's core themes of high school life in the late 90s managed to shine through. The film does indeed speak to teenage conformity, the pressures to fit in amongst peers, and to live up to parental expectations. And like I was saying earlier, I really do think that this film does kind of fit into those things, but it's just because the studio cut it really bad that, like, some of that stuff gets lost, which is kind of unfortunate. And, you know, I just feel like this movie is, again, it's not perfect. It is ultimately flawed, but I do think, like, would have been so interesting. And also, I'm not going to go into a whole Stepford Wives discussion today, because who knows, I could cover that movie on another episode. I don't know. I do love the Stepford Wives a lot, and I like the fact that this is kind of an update to that, because when I watched this movie, and you watch the original Stepford Wives, do not watch that 2004 remake, it's so horrible, but, you know, when I watch this, I'm like, yeah, I see what they're going with that. If they had influence to that, I absolutely believe it, like, completely. And I just think, like, it's so interesting that the production history of this is kind of varied. You could definitely go down the rabbit hole. I would say definitely look into, if you want to find out more information about this, there's definitely YouTube videos about it that you can kind of go down the rabbit hole with. One of the ones I like is our boy Cecil Trachtenberg from Good Bad Flicks. He did a whole video on this, whereas I got some of the information from that that I shared on this podcast. And so he's a great guy and love him. I like that. I enjoy Cody Leach on YouTube. He has a nice little video because he actually kind of likes this movie, and he talks a little bit about that as well, which is kind of where I came first aware of some of the background of this movie and what the fuck was going on with that. So yeah, I definitely think go check those guys out. And yeah, I just think like this movie I think it ultimately kind of got what it wanted to in a way, but because of studio interference, I think that voice kind of got silenced a little bit more than I would have wanted. So now that we've kind of gone over the crazy production history, the crazy release history of this movie, and we all mourned the death of the fact that we probably will never get a director's cut of this movie, let's move on to a plot summary of the theatrical cut of Disturbing Behavior. So we open our movie with our MGM opening, and then we have our intro sequence where we have this like really fun opening theme music where it's like dun dun, and it's like really I love the opening theme to this movie. It's really good theme music. So we have it kind of going in and out of like, all the different people who are in the movie and like who the people who are involved in it and everything like that. And I did put in my notes Lisa Beach, because Lisa Beach is the casting director on this movie. If you don't already know Lisa Beach, that's our girl from casting Scream, and she cast, I think, Jawbreaker and like a couple different things. Love us some Lisa Beach, okay? She cast all the teen movies in the day, so love her. So we come in on a car in the night, who is with youths making out in it. So we have our one dude, who is Andy Efkin, who I believe is played by Tobias Meller, who would then go on to be, I believe, Tommy Ross in the 2002 version of Carrie. And he's also Canadian, I believe. They had him, playing Andy. He's one of the Blue Ribbons. And, anyway, so he and this chick are, Mary Jo, I believe her name is. They are making out in this car, kind of sort of, because that's what kids do. And so anyway, they're doing that. Gavin, played by Nick Stahl, he is walking his dog, and he's also kind of being a bit of a creeper and watching them kind of kiss up in the car a little bit, like they're on like over this lookout point type of place, and then he's like on the like a hill or whatever. He's kind of watching them a little bit, but then the police come by. I think this is Sheriff Cox or something like that, but I think it's played by Steve Railsback if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, he comes by, and because Mary Jo decides she's going to go down on Andy, and this like makes Andy's hormones and all that go crazy. He then ends up killing her by snapping her neck, and he calls her a slut if I'm not mistaken. So wonderful late 90s, fucking misogyny, but okay, great. So then, actually, this isn't Sheriff Cox, I don't think. It may not be, because he ends up killing this cop, is what happens with Andy. He ends up killing that cop, but I think Sheriff Cox is there, though, where I guess, like, he ends up kind of covering up for the whole thing, it seems like, because it was kind of like, this is where we start to get the thing of, like, something's wrong going on in this little town here. So that's what we have our little opening with. And again, Gavin saw all of this happen. So, of course, this is just kind of, with him, has this whole thing of, something's going on, and he saw this happen. And so it just kind of adds to what we then will find out later about what's exactly going on in this town. And we are in the town of Cradle Bay, where we end up finding out. We are then on a ferry boat the next day, where we are introduced to our main character of Steve, played by James Marsden, and we see him and his sister Lindsay, played by baby Catherine Isabel. And so I put in my notes baby Catherine Isabel and James Marsden because Catherine Isabel, I think, is a literal teenager in this movie, if I'm not mistaken. And James Marsden, I mean, listen, I know he's supposed to be a high school student. None of these fucking people look like they're in high school, okay? So he looks like a literal 26-year-old because I think he was. Anyway, but what we do, so on the ferry, we meet them, and we meet the family that's moving into Cradle Bay, and this is Steve and his family. So you have him, Lindsay, and then his mom and dad, and they are moving into the house, and so they get off of the ferry with their little U-Haul truck and everything, and they're moving into this like really nice ass like house that's like overlooking this water or whatever, and it's like really nice and pretty, but we don't exactly know why they've moved. We just know that apparently, I guess they're moving from Chicago, and they are moving to this place. As I stated before, this is actually Canada. This is all shot in, but I think we're supposed to believe that this is supposed to be like the Pacific Northwest, so like Washington State or something like that. We then see that Lindsay is playing with an alien and doing kind of an alien autopsy. I thought that was kind of fun, and apparently it's supposed to be kind of a subtle reference to X-Files because, of course, David Nutter came from doing the X-Files, so I thought that was kind of fun. But then we have the next day, and I think there's also, before this, we do have a scene where Steve is in his room and his dad's in there too, and he's just like saying like, are you nervous for your first day of school tomorrow? He's like, oh, no, I'm not worried about it, da-da-da. And then we see that Steve is unpacking some of his stuff, and we see that he has a picture of him and his brother, who is technically, we don't know what's actually happened with him. We only get a little bit of a sliver because his brother is played by Ethan Embry, so his older brother, I guess. And so we see that they're together in a photo from the past, but we don't actually know what's really happening with that. So the next day, Steve goes to school. So he goes to this fun Canadian school, probably with a bunch of Canadian extras and stuff like that. And we are introduced to English class. So we're in the English class where this is one of Steve's classes. And we see that this guy, Dickie Atkinson, comes in late to class. And Dickie is kind of one of these like Motorhead type of guys. Like he's just like a shit stirrer, and he's just like kind of a troublemaker or whatever. We then see that Dickie comes in class late, and we see that there are these like clean cut kids that are like the popular kids, which we will then find out are the Blue Ribbons. And pretty much something about like Dickie calls like the teacher a peckerhead or something. I feel like this movie, it has to be R, obviously, because they do swear in it and whatever, but I don't understand the idea of using the term peckerhead when you really could just say dickhead, but whatever, it's fine. Anyway, but Dickie, because one of the Blue Ribbons kind of mouths off to Dickie, and he gets into a fight with him, and so Dickie then gets sent to the principal's office, and it's like a whole thing. So this is really set up that Dickie is kind of like this rebellious and kind of just like, takes no shit type of dude, and whatever, and then we'll find out what happens to Dickie. But anyway, so then we are then in the lunchroom with Gavin and UV. So we are in the lunchroom where Steve is, and then Gavin and UV is played by Chad Dinella, the guy from Final Destination, who is put into all of this makeup to make him look like a pale guy. They introduce themselves to Steve, and so they kind of give a intro to all these different groups within the movie. So like we meet like the Motorheads, which I guess like Dickie's kind of a part of. The Motorheads, we see the Micro Geeks, we see the Skaters, and then we see our intro to the Blue Ribbons. And so it's funny because each one of these groups got a different light kind of tint to them, which I thought was really funny. And it's also kind of this interesting like little foreshadow to something like that kind of scene in a high school movie, so something like a la Mean Girls or things like something like that. But it's kind of funny that they had this in this movie. But we get the intro to the Blue Ribbons because Gavin was kind of giving a lowdown on the other groups and talking about, like, you know, this is their kind of music they prefer. This is the drug they'd be. This is the plans they would have on Saturday night or whatever. And the Blue Ribbons are pretty much seen as like these clean cut American kids who are, you know, just doing all the great for society or whatever. And that's who these people are. That is exactly what they're supposed to be. And so, you know, you can't really get in with them. Like, again, they're kind of the popular group of the school, if you will. So we have our fun little lunch scene and all that stuff. And this is kind of ingratiating Gavin and UV to Steve in a way. And because Steve is just kind of he's a handsome guy, but like he isn't necessarily just like right with the Blue Ribbons right away. You know what I mean? Or anything like that. He's just kind of floating around, really. So I just thought that was interesting that Gavin is trying to get in his good graces, if anything. But yeah, so then you have dinner time at Steve's house. So we have like Lindsay and a friend of hers who joins for dinner, and then we have the rest of the family. And Lindsay talks about how like she had a brother or something like that. And this kind of then brings up this idea that like, okay, something happened to the brother. And so we end up finding out that this is actually where we find out, because Steve says something about how he had a brother that died. And then that's kind of why they moved here in a way, kind of, sort of. And that's like hinted at this scene. And it obviously makes the parents, the mom and dad, they makes them a little uncomfortable, of course. And then I think like Steve just kind of storms out because he's just kind of pissed off when it comes to this kind of thing. We then have a scene with Dickie, who is driving out to this like dock or whatever. And he is going and picking up like car parts because, again, he's a motorhead guy. And so he goes out to the dock. And he is surrounded by all of these blue ribbons, and you can always tell the blue ribbons by like their Letterman jackets that they have on and all of this. And they really just surround him and they swarm him. And pretty much what they do is, I put in my notes question mark, but I guess what they do is that what they end up doing to him, I don't think they end up beating him or anything. They really just end up overpowering him, because then we'll get to it in a minute. So then what ends up happening is, after you have this scene, which I'm sure was probably cut for some reason, or was cut it around or something, but Steve then meets Dr. Caldecott, who is played by Bruce Greenwood. He is like this doctor in the neighborhood who is, I don't know, he's just known as like this particular kind of guy, who's been really helping with, like, you know, he's kind of a psychiatrist sort of guy, I guess. And so he's really helped some of the kids in the, you know, he has helped some of the kids in the community, especially with the blue ribbons and things like that. And so then we get their introduction, but Steve isn't really feeling Dr. Caldecott. He's just like, he doesn't really trust these adults, really. I don't believe, because they're trying to like show him that, like, hey, we understand it's okay. We end up finding out about a tragedy back home, because they talk about that in the scene. And so this is where we get the idea that, like, okay, like, we know that the older brother died, I guess. And then we also know that it was something where they moved. So this is where you're getting all of this information, okay? Because they're moving here because they moved because of that whole death. But then we have, after this scene, and again, it's showing that, like, Steve does not trust these people. He does not trust Dr. Caldecott. It's really kind of given to it here. We then have our intro to Rachel, who is Wood Creek's trash, or whatever. Woodridge's Wood Creek's trash, or whatever. Was what the people call her. But anyway, she's played by Katie Holmes, and she is a friend of Gavin and UV's. So she's supposed to be this kind of like alternative indie type chick. Now listen, I love Katie Holmes just as much as anybody else does. I'm glad you got a Scientology girl, and, you know, you better get your money. But anyway, like, but you can't make me believe that, like, she's supposed to be some indie chick just because you put her in like some darker clothing or whatever. I watched some of the Dawson's Creek, man. Okay, listen, girl, okay. Anyway, but I'll buy it. I guess it's a movie, whatever. But anyway, so we have our intro to Rachel, and so we see who she is, and I think Steve takes a little bit of a liking to her. So, you know, that's fun. We have the gang decides to go out and hang out later that night, And so, because again, Steve is trying to find a groove and he's trying to find like, you know, a group to belong to. So why not get in with these guys? Because they seem cool. And so I think it's like Gavin is trying to go and like buy beer, or he's trying to get somebody to buy beer for him, even though they're fully adults. So like, whatever, but they're supposed to be teenagers, of course. But anyway, so we see like Gavin trying to accost people to like try and go buy them beer, but nobody wants to really hear him. Anyway, so then we see that Chug, who is played, I believe, by AJ Buckley, he's one of the Blue Ribbons, and he is inside of the supermarket that they are outside of. And so what ends up happening is, like, he seems to be interested in Rachel, and you see that he's interested in her because he looks at her from outside of the window that he's looking through. And what ends up happening is he's there and he looks at Rachel and it turns him on, it like, because he's like really interested in her. And so this like sets something off in his brain where now he becomes this like angry, upset person who, I guess, like, this kid or this teenager got into his way or something, and he ends up beating the fuck out of this guy. I mean, like, throwing him around the fucking supermarket, so much so that the people outside are like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, what is up with this? And so after you see all of this, and again, he gets away with it because he's a Blue Ribbon. They can do goddamn no wrong. So you have this. And so the gang, as I'm referring to them as, so that is Steve, UV, Gavin, and Rachel, I guess. I'm considering them the gang, or maybe if UV's not there, they're still the gang to me. But they hypothesize about what exactly is going on with these jocks. So, like, they go and they drive out to some place and they talk about how, like, Gavin has this theory that, like, you know, something's going on in Cradle Bay with these jocks, and, like, you know, Rachel says, like, maybe it's a steroid thing, like, they're all into it, and that's just, like, a side effect of it. But then Gavin has a more kind of a deeper conspiracy idea of, like, what's exactly going on with this. After we get our little hypothesis session of, like, just trying to think of, like, what's going on with everything, you know, and just what could be going on, we see that Gavin, I guess it's the next day now, and Gavin is heading to the boiler room with Steve in tow, and he's talking about Mary Jo, because Mary Jo was a friend of his and I guess has now gone missing. And so nobody seems to like be thinking about her or like whatever else, right? And so anyway, what ends up happening is that they're talking about them, but they're going through the boiler room because apparently it's the best place you can like sneak a smoke or something like that. So they're going in there for some reason, but then we end up getting William Sadler. Yay. That's what I have in my notes. And this is Dorian Newberry, who is the school janitor. William Sadler, for those who don't know, is an actor guy. He is been covered on this podcast before because he was actually Death in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. And he's a really fun actor and I really love him. Anyway, so Mr. Newberry, who's I guess who I'll call him, he is trying to scare rats. We get that idea that he uses these high frequencies to like scare away rats or whatever. And so we see that he has these like radios that like help to do that. And that's what he's interested in doing. Then we end up getting that scene. So this is to set up like, you know, who exactly Mr. Newberry is and all of this. But then we leave this scene to go to another scene where we see that Dickie from earlier, you know, that Motorhead guy, he is actually destroying his own car with the blue ribbons. So we see that they're outside, you got all these people around them, and they're literally taking a sledgehammer to his car, which would be like a prized possession of his. So for example, when we see Dickie leaving school, for example, I think earlier, we see him driving away in this car. And so now he's going and like literally destroying it because he has now become a blue ribbon. We see that he is more clean cut now. He doesn't look the same as he did before, and he's been kind of brought into this group. And so that's happening with that. Then we have, there is a scene where we have Steve goes to the yogurt shop. So we have this little yogurt shop set up. And so what ends up happening is he goes in there and then we see Trent, who is one of the blue ribbons, and he actually takes Steve, who they call him Steven, which I don't think he exactly likes, but he is taken over, and Trent intros the rest of the Blue Ribbons to him. So, we meet like Randy and Lorna, we meet, obviously like Andy and some of the other people as well, Chug, and then also Dickie, who again is the newest of the bunch. Anyway, but then Gavin comes in because Steve is kind of sitting with them a little bit, kind of sort of, but he's kind of like side-eyeing it a little bit too. Anyway, but Gavin comes in to the Yogurt Shop and he fucks with the Blue Ribbons because he's just like kind of making fun of them a little bit, and he doesn't really take them all that seriously, and they don't like him either, so they kind of like jab him back a little bit and all that. But what ends up happening is that Steve and Gavin, they end up leaving the Yogurt Shop because Steve makes it clear that he doesn't like the Blue Ribbons really either. They're trying to ingratiate him into the group and trying to be like, hey, like you should become a Blue Ribbon, or oh hey, da 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 da, because they're probably thinking like, oh, this like young handsome guy, like da da da, let's bring him into our group. But he's not having any of it because he's kind of distrustful to a lot of different people. And anyway, so Steve and Gavin, they leave, and Gavin pretty much tells Steve outside the Yogurt Shop, he's telling him about what he thinks the Blue Ribbons are, pretty much, like what's going on with them. Like, listen, I think these people have been like, I don't know what's going on with them, but like they're being, like controlled. They're being, this is what's happening to them. Because he gives a picture, actually, he shows a picture to Steve of these Blue Ribbons actually being more rebellious. This is where we find out that these Blue Ribbons used to actually be way more rebellious. They were partying more, drinking, doing stuff that they weren't supposed to do. And they were his friends. You know what I mean? And so he even says that, like, that, these are my friends. And like, now they're this. And, it just doesn't make any kind of sense on him at all. Apparently, also, as I was talking earlier, there apparently is a scene where I don't know where it would have come up from. Maybe it's a little later in the movie. But apparently there is a scene. There's apparently a scene where Gavin takes Steve to a morgue and he shows Mary Jo's body to him, where I guess the tattoo that she had, which we see from earlier, because Andy says something about her tattoo and how it's self-mutilation. As a tattooed person, I don't appreciate that, but whatever, it's fine. But anyway, so there's that. But then also, she's apparently been decapitated as well. So we don't actually ever see this scene. I would have to actually try to find it, I guess. Maybe it's on somewhere. I can go find it. Maybe I get the Blu-ray or something. But I kind of want to see what that scene is and see where it would have fit in this movie. Because maybe, I guess they would have had to at some point. But anyway, so then we have, back to our plot summary. But anyway, so Gavin and Steve, what they end up doing is they spy on this Blue Ribbon meeting. And this is a meeting where all of the parents of the Blue Ribbons, I guess they come together. And this meeting is led by Dr. Caldecott. And they're talking just about, like, what are the Blue Ribbons going to do? Like, what are the plans that they're going to do this month, or whatever they're doing, right? And so one of the parents like says, hey, as much as we love that Andy has improved with this, like, he just seems a lot different. And then Caldecott is talking about how, like, something or other, he's just trying to explain away what's exactly going on with them, like if these kids seem sort of different or what's going on with them. He's explaining it away. This is also the scene where we actually are supposed to have a longer scene of Caldecott talking about his daughter in the movie, because we find out that he actually has a daughter, but we actually don't find that out in this movie right away. But in the scene, we were supposed to find that out. But again, I guess, this shit got cut. So we didn't know that. But yes, so this is where we're supposed to find that out. But what ends up happening is that Gavin finds out that, like, his parents have signed him up for the Blue Ribbons, pretty much, because they end up talking about, like, who's going to be the next person to be brought in. And so they talk about, like, the profile of this kid who's going to be brought into that and everything like that. And we end up finding out that Gavin's parents are there, and he sees his parents. He's like, oh shit, my parents signed me up for this program. And so that's what ends up happening. So Gavin freaks the fuck out. So yeah, Gavin realizes that his parents have signed him up for this. what ends up happening is they leave spying on the meeting, and they go to like this like shorefront that they're at, and Steve and Gavin are having a moment because they're trying to be like, okay, well, maybe it's just not really anything more than just like these kids getting together and just doing things to kind of better the community or whatever. Maybe that's what this is. But Gavin is just like, no, this is way more sinister. This is way worse. Like, and you know what? Like, I'm actually going to, because he then shows he's planning on killing all of the adults involved. Like, he literally shows Steve that he has a gun, and he literally is planning to, like, he's gonna smoke them, that's what he says. And so, like, I also think it's interesting because I feel like we get the idea that Steve, and I guess to a point UV, because we actually find out that UV does sell weed, I guess. But anyway, so like, we are to expect that, like, okay, so especially Gavin, I guess, Gavin and UV, but Gavin especially, he is this kind of stoner kid. Like, he very much is supposed to be that kind of archetype. But then I kind of wonder, like, is he doing these drugs to, like, kind of numb something in him because of the fact that this is all happening around him, and, like, he's using these drugs to kind of make himself something different than what his friends have turned into? I always kind of wondered that a little bit as well. Because again, it's to be assumed that from what Gavin says, these people who were the Blue Ribbons used to be his friends. And then they got turned into these like perfect automatons, you know what I mean? So it's like, I just always thought that was interesting. Like, why does he use drugs to kind of like dull that sensation, or dull the pain that he feels, or the dulls, or numbs the pain or something like that, or numbs something. But anyway, so I just thought that was always really interesting. But of course, like, Steve is like, no, you're not going to fucking kill these people. I'm taking this gun. Like, don't even fucking try it. Like, all this. And so this is where Gavin is all like, don't leave me alone out here. Like, I thought I could trust you, all this. But then what ends up happening is Gavin just like walks home, and he just like walks in the middle of the night back home, I guess, because he and Steve go on their separate ways. So then we have our next day at school, and people are like all surprised, and they're looking around because we see that we see actually someone's feet, but then we find out it's Gavin, and he has come to school, and he's a new dude because he is now clean cut. He has different hair. He looks very nice and handsome. Nick Stahl is he looks very attractive in this role when he's a lot more cleaned up. Even beforehand, he still was a pretty cute guy. But anyway, so he's a new ass dude though. Okay. And so anyway, so we have this, and even like Rachel's like, what the fuck is going on here, Gavin? Like, what are you doing? And so, of course, like, he kind of forgets about his old friends and all this. What ends up happening is that a fight breaks out in the lunchroom. And so what ends up happening is Steve gets beaten up by this, or Steve is trying to talk to like Gavin, but the Blue Ribbons are not letting him or anything like that. And then he's like not taking no for an answer, so like, Steve's trying to get in there, but then he ends up getting beaten up, and then like Rachel's trying to get in there a little bit too. Like, it's just not great. And then again, Steve ends up getting the shit kicked out of it in a way. So then we have our next scene, and this is the scene where Steve ends up going to the boiler room because he hates lunch, and he doesn't feel very included, obviously. So him and Mr. Newberry are in the boiler room. He says, "What are you doing here? Like, you're not supposed to be here." And all this in his like wonderful accent he's doing. And so like, we see this connection, or we see this relationship between Steve and Mr. Newberry in a way, where we have that. And Steve even sees a copy of Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut in the pants pocket of Mr. Newberry, and that is to kind of signify that like, oh, it's all an act, isn't it? Like, you're not really, because this up to this point, Mr. Newberry is kind of seen as like this like janitor guy. He's like a maintenance guy. He is thought to be of low intelligence in a way and whatever, but he ends up, but this is where Steve is all like, it's all an act, isn't it? Like, it's all bullshit, isn't it? Like, you're just doing this to whatever. And we end up finding out that in fact, actually it is an act, because even Mr. Newberry comes out and says, it's funny how people just ignore you when they think that you're not smart or whatever. And so you put this kind of act on, like, you can get away with quite a bit where people will just literally ignore you, which I thought was very interesting. This is, I think, also supposed to be where there was that longer scene where we find out what actually happened to what actually happened in the town, which kind of made this like a different thing. So as I stated before, this is supposed to be a scene where Mr. Newberry talks about how like 3 years ago there was these kids got drunk and they drove, and they ended up killing this woman and her kid by accident, and then they died as well. And so because of this, things started to change around Cradle Bay ever since Caldecott came and kind of were trying to really help these rebellious teens and all that kind of stuff. But again, because MGM wanted all these cuts, that's why we don't have it. But anyway, so pretty much what we find out is that Mr. Newberry has been putting on a whole act this whole time. And we do see that he's actually a smarter man than he is led on to be. And then also he's aware of what's kind of going on. He's aware of more than what we have seen at this point. Then you have Steve, who at this point now, we are like at night and he is walking through the woods and he's being pursued by these blue ribbons. And so he is like, being pursued by them. And it's like just very odd. Like, they're definitely kind of playing on his, kind of just like, yeah, he's just like scared because he's just like, oh my God, like they're coming after me. They're like surrounding me. Anyway, so he ends up coming home. Steve ends up coming home to his house, and Lorna is there, who's one of the blue ribbon ladies. And he's like, what are you doing here? And she's like, oh, I was helping to tutor Lindsay, your sister, in algebra. Like, she's a very special girl. And so then he's like, okay, you gotta go home. Like, you gotta leave. And she's like, oh, well, can I at least use your bathroom? And he's like, yeah, sure, that's fine. Anyway, so then we end up seeing that Steve is at home, and then Lorna is using the bathroom, like washing her hands or whatever. And so she ends up looking at him, and it's the same kind of thing with Chug earlier, where we have this kind of like red robot ass, like Terminator ass looking, Predator ass looking, I don't know, like, kind of overlay. And like, you see this and you see that, there's this red eye that Lorna has, and like something's going on with it. And you start to see that I guess she's getting turned on by Steve because she thinks that he is attractive, and she pretty much starts to, I guess, malfunction in a way, because you start seeing that she's not acting like her normal self. Normally she's very reserved, she's very much prim and proper, and now she decides she is going to put it all out there on the table. And she literally like unbuttons her blouse, where you do see her titties, you see her boobs. Again, this is supposed to be a teenager, so I feel a little weird about this, but okay, whatever. So you see that like she is like pretty much throwing it at Steve. She's like wanting him real bad, and he doesn't want it. He's just like, okay, you need to go. Like, he's just like kind of like, oh God, this is weird. And then you end up seeing that she's realizing what she's doing, and she is like, this is wrong. It's bad. It's wrong. And the fact that this actress has really only been in this movie and never was really in anything else, I think is a shame, because I think she actually did a really good job with this role personally. But things happen. But we see that this very much is kind of a, I feel like this scene is a little bit of a reference to the scene in Stepford Wives. If you've seen the original Stepford Wives, you would know that, I guess, spoiler, but Bobby, who is Joanna's friend in this movie, ends up getting turned into a robot. And so she has this whole scene where Joanna goes to Bobby's house and sees her there and like stabs her or whatever is what happens, because she realizes Joanna actually realizes what's going on in Stepford, and she realizes that Bobby has been turned into a robot. And so we see that Bobby is like, malfunctioning or whatever, and all this, like, and she sees what's actually going on. And this just reminded me of that a little bit, because like literally like Lorna like hits her head on the mirror and like she's bleeding out of her head. And then she's like, I have to go. I have a big physics test tomorrow. So she doesn't even realize what's gone on and what's transpired. And so like literally Steve is all like, what the actual fuck? Like, okay. And Steve is starting to wonder like what exactly is going on, because he even saw like the eye with Lorna. He sees it and he's just like, wait, what the fuck was that? Like, what is this? And again, it's just, he doesn't exactly realize what's going on, but like, he's just like, has the suspicions of like, okay, there is something going on with these kids. Like, I don't know what the hell is going, I don't know what is going, but something's up. So we end up finding out, actually, this is where we really find, because we are brought in to a surgeon, and we see another surgeon who happens to be our boy, Dr. Caldecott. And we find out that pretty much the blue ribbons are being mind controlled and brainwashed by Caldecott. So this is where we kind of get that first inkling of it, because he's obviously there. They talk about Lorna and like how she needs to get her chip recalibrated and like all this stuff. And this is what we're going to do and blah, blah, blah. Because again, this happens. So this is our first bit of understanding that Caldecott really is the villain in this movie. I'm sure there's more development of this character in some way, shape, or form, but guess what? We don't have it. But anyway, it's fine. But so then we have the next scene, which we have Rachel and Chug, who are in the boiler room. So Rachel comes into the boiler room, and then Chug kind of comes after her. She's hiding at first, and Chug's in there, and because we see that he's interested in her, and he's trying to like, he is trying to like get with her pretty much. So she like comes out of hiding, and she's like comes out because he's like, Rachel, I know you're in here, like, you can come out. And she comes out, and he's all like, hey, look, like, I just want to know, like, will you go out with me? And Rachel's all like, you're kidding, right? And she's just like, no, I will not go out with you. And then of course he yells, he's just like, why not? And that's always just a crazy scene. But he like yells at her, and she's just like, I'm not interested in you like that, like at all. I would not be interested in you at all. Like, you are like pieces of shit and like maggots. Like, it's not, I'm not interested in you. But then he kind of overpowers her a little bit, and he's trying to like kind of sexually assault her, really. Like, he pins her up against like this thing in the boiler room, and he's like trying to actually like assault her. But then what ends up happening though is that somebody, I wonder who, turns on this like high frequency radio where it's this high pitched noise that starts to make Chug malfunction. It allows Rachel to be able to then get away, and for Chug to have that. I wonder who could have done that, but our good old Mr. Newberry. But we do see that he's kind of the one who had that. But then of course Chug has to go and break the radio and all this, and so he ends up doing that. And then of course we have like the casual use of the R word in this movie as well, which is not always the best, but it is what it is. This is 1998. But because they see Mr. Newberry as kind of this guy of lower intelligence, so they call him the R word when really he is not at all. But yeah, so we have that. Then we have Steve and Lindsay. They're walking up the road to their house, and the blue ribbons drive by their house as well. Because again, they're intimidating Steve at this point. We see that Lindsay has like this blue ribbon around her wrist because she got it at school, but he's wondering like, where did you get this from? Like, why do you have this? Anyway, so then we see that Rachel and Steve, they get together because I think Steve even calls Rachel, or he goes to her house or something like that. And they end up talking about like, hey, we need to talk. And she's like, yeah, I think you need to see something. And so we see that they watch a video from Gavin from before he had changed, to where he's giving it this information about like, here is what I know about Caldecott. Here's what you need to know about this, that, and the third. Like, he's pretty much giving all this information that he has been thinking about of what's actually been happening in Cradle Bay. And he is putting this out on video, and he's then gave it to Rachel, I guess, or something, so that after he got turned, all of his information that is out there is able to now be taken by these friends of his, pretty much. Yeah, that's pretty much what he's talking about. He's what's going on. He gives some insight into what's going on. And so what they end up finding out, because Rachel did her 1998 research, and they found out that Caldecott actually worked at a mental hospital. He did like surgery, and things like that. He had worked in a mental institution. And so in this situation, they decide they're going to go pay a little visit. So they get on the late night ferry and they decide to go and visit the mental institution of where Dr. Caldecott used to work. So they end up finding that out. In the meantime, while they're on the ferry, I guess this is I guess it's not late at night, but they get on the ferry to go over to visit this place. And this is where we actually find out about Steve's older brother, because he actually talks about it a little bit more, about what exactly happened. But here is the thing, I'm going to bring it back. So we find out in this cut that I guess Steve's older brother, Alan, played by Ethan Embry, is supposed to have been somebody who he looks up to a lot, but he was always just so sad. And what ended up happening is that he died of suicide, right? Like that's kind of the picture we get. But we end up actually, from when you look at the cut of the movie that got cut, we find out that actually what really happened, I think, was that did happen, but also I believe that Alan also killed his girlfriend and then shot himself or something. I don't exactly know because I don't know what the fucking cut is. But there's a little bit more to the story than just Alan, killed himself and then that's why we moved or whatever. It's a little bit deeper than just that. But then that's when we find out how they pretty much moved and why they were coming to Cradle Bay in the first place. Anyway, so then we have Steve and Rachel. They explore the mental hospital. So they just sneak up in there and they're just going around. So we see a couple of the patients that are there. So they end up going to this kind of open day room, if you will, where you have these people who are mentally ill. Like one guy's brushing his teeth a bunch, and then there's this other girl who's doing some other stuff or whatever. I don't know. You see this all going on, and then you see that Rachel and Steve, they end up going into this room with this young girl who just keeps repeating over and over again something about the musical Little Something or Others. And she's just repeating the same thing over and over again. And the patients all are starting to freak out from this girl saying this stuff. And they are ganging up on the window of the room that she's in, and also where Rachel and Steve are at. And this then prompts the security to then come in and start to try to see what's going on. And so then you end up having that they're trying to shut the girl up. And so they're just shut up. What are you doing? And so we see that then Rachel just hits the girl. She just punches her. And so we end up finding out, though, that this girl that Rachel literally just decked in the face is actually Caldecott's daughter. So this is where we find this out. But guess what? We didn't know that earlier. So we see that, but that's what we find out, is that Caldecott had his own daughter institutionalized because of whatever reason, probably because she just knew the truth of what was actually going on and he wanted to put her away so nobody would actually hear the truth or something like that. And then I just have in my notes, fuck yes, flagpole sitta, because pretty much at this point, Rachel and Steve have to go and deuce out of this place. And so they just run out, and they're running out to Henry Danger's Flagpole Sitta, which is a great song. And it was in the trailer of this movie and has also been used to good effect in the movie from Netflix, Do Revenge, which I will talk about how I really like that movie. And it's a great movie. And they use Flagpole Sitta really well in it. But anyway, so they run the hell out of the mental institution, and we see that Rachel and Steve, they're driving away. So they're driving and they're just let's get the fuck out of here. So they stop at a gas station because, again, they're having to get back on the ferry to try to go back home. And the police, which I think is Sheriff Cox or whatever, he is there and he ends up confronting Steve and Rachel. So of course, he's just oh, you're passed out after curfew. You're out passed out you're out past curfew. Like, what are you doing? And they're like, well, studying. And they're like, well, where are your books? And like all this. And so, of course, intimidating, a cab. Ugh. But anyway, so we see that Mr. Newberry is like driving around in his like piece of shit car that he has. And so he comes up to kind of distract a little bit. Like, he seems to kind of be in on what's going on a little bit. Mr. Newberry comes up, and again, so what happens is that the sheriff like ends up taking Rachel and Steve, and he's about to like put them in the back of his car, right? Like, he's about to like, again, a cab. So like, he's about to throw them in the back of his car, like police car, and do whatever the fuck, right? But then Mr. Newberry is all like really a cab, and he's like, fuck the police. And he literally knocks the sheriff out to give Rachel and Steve a chance to escape. So this then gives Rachel and Steve the chance to escape out in the car. I just want you all to know that my cat is right here, right next to my microphone, and she looks very cute. And she's just being really adorable. But anyway, so then we see that Steve comes back to his house, and he's trying to escape with Lindsay. So like, he's deciding, hey, like, I'm leaving, like I'm going back to Chicago with Lindsay. Like, I need to get her out of here because he is her big brother. And anyway, so then Steve almost gets turned because the parents have called in Caldecott to kind of see what he can do to like help. And, they're enrolling him in the program to like help with this. And then this is where you get the scene of like, we're just trying to do what's best for you. And he's like, well, what about what I want and all this. And again, I will always bring it back to the fact that there was scenes that were cut out of this. And so what ended up happening was that the mother actually found the gun from earlier where Gavin had it, and Steve, I guess, took it. And so that's what kind of prompted her to like call Dr. Caldecott and try to see what he could do to help. So again, this kind of comes out of nowhere in the theatrical cut, but like in the actual director's cut, you actually do get a little bit of that background with that. But anyway, so then you see that he almost gets turned because they're about to like take him, but he's able to get out though. Steve is able to escape. I don't think Lindsay gets to really, she kind of does, but like, he has to kind of go out on his own. Steve does. And so the Blue Ribbons decide to attack him pretty much is what happens. They just kind of swarm him, and they really are just kind of like, they just overpower him at this point, because yeah, why not? Now, I will say that for Stepford Wives, this doesn't exactly happen with the wives themselves, because the wives were already turned into robots. It's more the men in the society of that movie and the community who are kind of in on it, obviously. So, that's a whole thing. I think I've already said it on this podcast, but I hated Don't Worry, Darling. And I think it's weird that Olivia Wilde never said that it was inspired by the Stepford Wives or anything like that, because it very much was. Anyway, let me get off my soapbox there. But anyway, so we see that Steve is taken, and he is like being led on a gurney. He's being pushed into like this fucking, I don't even know, like some underground lair, I guess, where he is going to get turned. So this is the place from earlier where I guess Lorna had to go after she malfunctioned. And so he's in the same place. Rachel's also there. They also took her, and they're deciding they're also going to like, turn her into a good girl, and they're going to turn Steve into a good boy. Anyway, so then what ends up happening is that in the middle of him being put on this chair, which apparently is supposed to be a reference to Total Recall, I guess, Steve is like strapped to this chair, and his like face is strapped in, and they're about to put this light on him, and like there's just all this drama going on, right? And what ends up happening is that Steve is able to get his arm or something. He's able to like break out and actually like overpower the scientist to be able to like, kind of do what he needs to do to get out. And then he also takes Rachel with him. He goes over to her, and he's able to break her out as well, because that's his love and he loves her. But anyway, so then they're escaping together, and she's kind of like, she's kind of tired, and she's just like been overpowered or whatever. And so we do see that there's that going on, and then we also see that Rachel and Steve, they're leaving, but then Chug stops them because, again, he's talking about, like, that's my girl, Steve. That's my girl, Steven, you know, and of course she's not his girl and all of this. But then what ends up happening is they're fighting Chug and they're overpowering him and they're able to beat him up to be like, you know, fuck you guys. Like, you know, we're getting out of here. And all of that. So, and we're coming up near the end of the movie at this point by now, but we do see that they are able to get out of, I guess it was the mental institution or wherever the fuck they were at. And we see that UV and Lindsay have arrived in the car together, and they've arrived and they're taking everyone together. So it's UV, Lindsay, Steve, and Rachel, and they're all leaving, and the gang is escaping, but then we have a blue ribbons roadblock. So, like, literally the blue ribbons are, like, literally blocking off the road so where they can't escape. And they're like, oh no, fuck, what do we do? But then what ends up happening is, like, so they stop their car, but then Mr. Newberry, our savior, he is driving up in his car and he is coming over. And pretty much what he does is he, like, comes up the road and he ends up turning like a sharp left or something like that, and he pretty much fucks their shit up. And the way he fucks their shit up is that he has all of these high frequency radios like we were seeing earlier, and he has them set to where it will overpower the blue ribbons because they are sensitive to these high frequency sounds or whatever. And so that all happens and he comes and fucks their shit up to where he gets to kind of overpower them. I think we also do see Steve driving on a motorcycle at some point as well. That happens. But this is where we get the scene where Steve comes to Mr. Newberry and he's there with the car and all this. And we find out that Mr. Newberry actually has been stabbed, I guess, because we see the wound on his stomach. And we see that he is deciding to pretty much sacrifice himself because he lures the other thing too is that he lures the blue ribbons in with, like, you know, this sound or whatever, and he's like had them get on his car and all this stuff to like kind of overpower him. But even Steve says something about like, well, what if they can be helped? And he's like, nobody can be helped in this town, and not even me. And that's when we find out he got stabbed. So this is where we have our the iconic line before he dies, but we have Mr. Newberry, like, his car and all of these blue ribbons kids are on it, and he's like, hey teacher, leave those kids alone. And he like literally drives his car with these blue ribbons and all them off the cliff, and he dies with them as well. So he like sacrifices himself. And then we see that Caldicott's there. Caldicott is all like, you know, science is God and all of this. And so Steve and Caldicott, they're fighting on the cliffside because, again, Caldicott is the villain of this movie. And, you know, Steve has to fight him or whatever because he's left the other three to get on the ferry without him. Pretty much at this point. And he's like, go meet me there and I'll meet you there. Like, you know, get on there and I'll be there. But then we see that Steve, he says something because, like, I think he gets on a ledge of this and Caldicott, like, grabs his foot or something. And he just says something about, like, be the ball. Like, and then he, like, kicks Caldicott and literally kicks Caldicott off the cliffside. And, like, literally Caldicott falls off the cliff and dies. So that's how we have the death of Caldicott and the death of the blue ribbons. And they all just die of just getting off the cliffside. Anyway, so then Steve ends up getting on his motorcycle that he has acquired. And he ends up going on the ferry, and he like gets on there, and Rachel and Steve are on the ferry together, and they kiss. Okay, and they kiss. So we see that Rachel and Steve are there, and then UV and Lindsay are there, and I guess the assumption is that they can't stay in Cradle Bay. And I guess they'll just have to go somewhere else. They're just going to have to make a new life for themselves some other place, I guess. When the original ending of this movie was actually, so literally, like, Steve does come to the ferry and all of this, but then Gavin is actually there. And he has a gun. And so the gun, he is like pointing it at them. And he's pretty much saying, like, you know, I'm going to like kill you because, you know, all of these people are now dead. Like, these were my friends, you know, and like, I don't want to be a blue ribbon, but I don't know what else I can do and all this kind of stuff. And he's pretty much going to shoot like literally Steve, because he's brought these guys down pretty much. And what ends up happening is that when he's about to shoot Steve, what ends up happening is that UV ends up shooting Gavin. And so then Gavin's taken down, and Gavin then comes kind of back to his normal self. And then pretty much what happens is that Gavin just dies at the end of this movie. And you literally have the actual end of the movie is literally Steve and Rachel, who they just are kind of like hugging one another. Like, you know, Rachel is like in Steve's like chest and just like, you know, oh God. And then they have like the beginning music, like the dun dun, you know, and all that. And they have that. So that's the original ending of this movie, the way more dark ending. So the end of our movie in the theatrical cut is that we are transported to this classroom of kids that are kind of like supposed to be kind of like rowdy or like something like that, you know, and they're supposed to be like, you know, oh, they need to be like, they need to learn manners, they need to learn this or whatever. And the teacher ends up saying, like, they're on their, like, they have, like, their music in, and they're, like, throwing things, like, whatever. And the teacher's all like, hey, you have a new student teacher today, like, you know, so give him some sort of respect, like, you didn't do the last one. And be like, you know, there he is, like, you know, this is Gavin Strick. And we end up finding out that Gavin is a student teacher, and he's now going to be brainwashing the youths. So that is where we end our movie on. And so that is the end of Disturbing Behavior. So as we wrap up on this episode about this movie, Disturbing Behavior, I do just want to like say that I'm very glad that I have found this movie. I think it's something where I can definitely enjoy it for what it is. It ended up becoming a movie that I think, you know, does get kind of lumped in with something like The Faculty, where I think people think that The Faculty is a little bit better. I kind of agree with them. I do think The Faculty is just a little bit of a better movie, but, you know, no tea. But, like, it's just, but I do see these movies as kind of a good double feature, especially, so definitely watch them, and, you know, watch them together for sure. But I do like this movie. I see the influence from something like The Stepford Wives, and I do think that I would love to see a director's cut of this film, and I would love to see what David Nutter really made happen and, you know, what he got to direct. And I would love to see the story in full. I would really like that. So, but I do think this movie, like, for the flaws that it has, I do think that it is a really interesting kind of work on, you know, what it's like to be a teenager and kind of the politics that come along with it. And then also conformity and brainwashing and things like that. I really do think it's a very interesting piece of that. And it will have that in here no matter what. I think that's the legacy this movie kind of has, is that it is this kind of teen film that, you know, teen horror film, if anything. And I think that's what it'll hopefully have a legacy for. And again, I think it also has the legacy of just being a movie that really got cut to shit and it really affected the movie in a way negatively. And then MGM thinking like, oh no, we got bad reviews. I wonder how that happened. You know what you did. But anyway, so right now, though, you can stream this on HBO Max. It's been on there for the longest fucking time. That and The Faculty are actually on HBO Max, so you can watch them both together. So that's really fun. And there is a Scream Factory Blu-ray of this. I do kind of want to get it. Apparently, a lot of the information is really just the same stuff you probably could get from the DVD. But again, that still includes some of the other scenes that are in there, the other alternative ending that's there, you know, things like that. So I think there's also like a commentary on here as well. So that's kind of cool. But I would definitely say just my takeaway from it is that Disturbing Behavior is definitely, I think, worth a watch. It's not as bad as I think some people may think it out to be or may make it seem to be. And I definitely think that if you are a fan of horror, especially kind of teen horror of the 90s or something like that, I think this is definitely worth a watch. And if you haven't already seen it, definitely give it a watch. And yeah, who doesn't love a good James Marsden, Katie Holmes film? Like, why not? You know, it's fun to see little baby actors of those caliber. But yeah, so yes, do yourself a favor and watch yourself some Disturbing Behavior. As always, if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do so at cultcinemacircle@gmail.com. If you'd like to give any movie recommendations, give feedback on the show, or if you'd just like to say hey, I'm open to all of it. You can also follow the show on Instagram at cultcinemacircle and on Twitter at cultcinecircle. I tend to announce the movies that I'm going to be covering and just interact with people on there if they want. You can also follow me on Letterboxd at Jesse, Jesse, Kremp, Kremp, all one word. On that platform, I tend to log the movies that I watch. I write little stupid reviews about them and just general foolishness over there. Be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast on your podcatcher of choice, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm pretty much on all of them. Be sure to leave 5 stars and a 1 to 2 sentence review about the show so we can grow the audience and then just spread the love all around. Be sure to tune in next week to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast, where I'll be covering 2006's John Tucker Must Die. After discovering they are all dating the same guy, 3 popular students from different cliques band together for revenge, so they enlist the help of a new gal in town and conspire to break the jerk's heart while destroying his reputation. As always, thank you for taking the time to listen to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast, and remember, don't worry about the snakes in your garden when you got spiders in your bed. Take care. Bye.